During the 1970s, Mexico's drug trade was entering a period of rapid transformation. What had once been a scattered collection of smugglers, small-time traffickers, and loosely connected transporters was slowly evolving into something more structured. The change did not happen in public view. It unfolded quietly through layers of unofficial arrangements, political calculations, and strategic decisions made far from the violence of border crossings and hidden airstrips. At the center of this transformation was a system of control that had begun to shape how the trade functioned. It was not designed to eliminate trafficking entirely. Instead, it attempted to organize it. In earlier years, smuggling networks across Mexico had operated with little coordination. Traffickers moved marijuana and opium through remote rural regions, relying on local contacts and improvised routes into the United States. Competition was unpredictable. Alliances shifted frequently, and disputes between groups could erupt without warning. For the authorities responsible for maintaining stability, this disorder created its own risks. Violence in the wrong place could attract unwanted international attention, and uncontrolled criminal activity threatened to disrupt the delicate political balance that governed much of the country. The emerging strategy focused on replacing chaos with supervision. Rather than dismantling every smuggling operation, the approach sought to concentrate power in the hands of a limited number of trusted trafficking figures. These individuals were not chosen randomly. Many had already proven themselves capable of managing large-scale operations while maintaining discretion. They understood the importance of stability, and they recognized that survival often depended on maintaining relationships not only with criminal partners, but also with officials who preferred predictable outcomes over constant conflict. As the system matured, territories began to take shape. Certain regions of Mexico became associated with particular trafficking families or networks. Smuggling routes were quietly defined, and unwritten boundaries were gradually understood by those involved. The arrangement did not eliminate competition entirely, but gave it limits. A trafficker who respected these boundaries could operate with a degree of confidence that rival groups would not immediately attempt to seize his territory. Behind the scenes, disputes still occurred. When they did, they were often handled through mediation rather than violence. Meetings between powerful figures in the trade became part of maintaining the balance. Agreements were negotiated in private settings where the stakes were understood by everyone present. These conversations were rarely about ideology or loyalty. They revolved around logistics, routes, shipments, payments, and the quiet understanding that stability served everyone's interests. For several years, this structure achieved what it was designed to do. The drug trade expanded, but it expanded in a controlled way. Smuggling operations became more efficient as experienced traffickers developed reliable supply chains. Rural cultivation zones connected to transportation corridors that moved product northward through highways, hidden airfields, and coastal routes. Each stage of the journey involved people who understood their roles and the limits of their authority. The growth of the United States drug market during this period accelerated everything. Demand increased dramatically during the late 1970s and early 1980s, particularly for marijuana and heroin, and traffickers who had once operated modest regional businesses suddenly found themselves managing operations worth millions of dollars. Profits began to reshape the scale of the industry. Money changed expectations. Families that had once worked quietly in agriculture or transportation began investing in larger distribution networks. New vehicles were purchased, airstrips were improved, and connections expanded across multiple states. Entire communities became economically tied to the trade, sometimes without fully understanding the structure that governed it. The individuals who had been granted territory within the system slowly transformed into powerful regional leaders. Their influence extended beyond smuggling itself. They controlled employment, transportation routes, and local political relationships that allowed operations to continue with minimal interference. For those inside the network, success depended on maintaining the balance that had made such growth possible. Yet the very success of the system carried its own consequences. The wealth generated by the expanding drug market created new ambitions among traffickers who had once been satisfied with smaller roles. Younger figures began to emerge within the organizations, often more aggressive and less patient with the slow negotiations that had defined earlier years. They had grown up observing the profits and influence of established leaders, and many believed they could achieve even greater power. At the same time, international attention toward drug trafficking was increasing. Pressure from the United States pushed Mexican authorities to demonstrate stronger enforcement efforts. Large eradication campaigns targeted marijuana fields, and new surveillance programs attempted to track smuggling routes more closely. The environment that had once allowed quiet arrangements to operate with relative stability was becoming more complicated. Within the trafficking network, this pressure produced a subtle shift in psychology. Leaders who had previously focused on cooperation began to think more defensively about their positions. Control over territory meant control over enormous revenue streams, and the possibility of losing that control became increasingly difficult to accept. Rivalries that had once been carefully managed now carried higher stakes. The system still functioned on the surface. Shipments continued moving northward, and the major trafficking figures maintained the appearance of coordination. But the balance that held everything together required constant adjustment. Each year brought new players, new opportunities, and new tensions that had to be managed behind closed doors. For those who had originally designed the structure, the challenge was becoming clear. The network had succeeded in centralizing the drug trade and reducing uncontrolled violence during its early years. But the organizations that emerged from this arrangement were no longer small operations that could be easily guided. They had become sophisticated enterprises with resources, loyal followers, and ambitions that extended far beyond the boundaries first assigned to them. The structure that once provided stability had gradually produced something more powerful than anyone initially expected. It had created a generation of traffickers who understood logistics, territory, and influence at a national scale. And as the profits of the global drug market continued to grow, the system faced a quiet but unavoidable reality. The organizations it had helped shape were becoming strong enough to operate on their own terms. By the early 1970s, Mexico's drug trade had begun to change in ways that few people outside a small circle of officials and traffickers fully understood. What had once been a scattered and informal collection of smuggling operations was gradually transforming into a more organized structure. The change did not arrive through public announcements or sweeping reforms. Instead, it unfolded quietly through private arrangements, carefully managed relationships, and a growing understanding among those involved that stability could be more profitable than chaos. Across northern Mexico, rural landscapes that had long supported small-scale cultivation were becoming more deeply connected to the expanding drug market. Remote mountain regions, dusty agricultural valleys, and isolated villages played subtle roles in a supply chain that stretched far beyond local communities. Farmers who had once relied on traditional crops now found themselves participating in something more lucrative, though rarely without risk. The work was discreet and often hidden from outsiders, yet the profits flowing through these regions were steadily increasing. At the same time, the routes that carried drugs north toward the United States were becoming more sophisticated. Smugglers learned which highways allowed for faster movement, which border crossings were easier to navigate, and which remote airstrips could receive small aircraft arriving under the cover of darkness. Each route required coordination, trust, and a shared understanding that unnecessary conflict could jeopardize the entire operation. The system that began to guide these activities relied on a simple but powerful idea: control through organization rather than constant confrontation. Instead of allowing every trafficker to compete for territory, certain individuals were permitted to manage specific regions. These arrangements were rarely written down, yet they were widely understood among those who participated in the trade. Boundaries existed not as lines on a map, but as agreements enforced through influence and reputation. Traffickers who operated within these boundaries often found themselves in a more stable position than their predecessors had been. Rather than fighting for every shipment or smuggling corridor, they could focus on expanding their operations within the areas assigned to them. Over time, this stability allowed some figures to develop networks that reached across multiple states. Their influence extended into transportation businesses, agricultural operations, and local economies that depended on the steady flow of money generated by the trade. Behind this growing structure was a quiet effort to manage rivalries before they erupted into violence. Disputes between traffickers were not uncommon, especially when shipments went missing or accusations of betrayal surfaced. But instead of allowing these conflicts to escalate immediately, efforts were often made to resolve them through negotiation. Meetings were arranged in private settings where powerful figures could discuss grievances and reach agreements that preserved the broader balance of the system. For several years, this approach proved remarkably effective. The drug trade expanded rapidly, yet the level of open conflict remained relatively limited compared to what might have occurred in a completely uncontrolled environment. Traffickers who followed the unwritten rules of the system were able to operate with a degree of predictability that had rarely existed in earlier decades. The economic incentives behind this arrangement were impossible to ignore. As demand in the United States grew during the late 1970s, the profits associated with drug trafficking increased dramatically. What had once been considered a risky but modest enterprise was now generating vast sums of money. Entire transportation networks were upgraded to handle larger shipments, and new connections were established with distributors across the border. In many communities, the effects of this wealth were visible in subtle ways. New homes appeared in regions that had previously struggled with poverty. Local businesses benefited from increased spending, and infrastructure projects sometimes received quiet funding from individuals whose sources of income were rarely discussed openly. For residents of these areas, the drug trade was not always perceived as an abstract criminal enterprise. It was often intertwined with daily life and economic survival. Yet beneath the outward stability of the system, tensions were quietly building. The same structure that had allowed certain traffickers to grow powerful was also creating a new generation of ambitious figures who had grown up observing that success. Younger members of these organizations were often less patient with the careful negotiations that had defined earlier years. Many believed that greater profits could be achieved through expansion, even if it meant challenging existing boundaries. The growing international focus on drug trafficking added another layer of pressure. During the 1980s, increased attention from American authorities led to stronger calls for enforcement efforts within Mexico. Large eradication campaigns targeted marijuana and opium fields, sometimes disrupting cultivation regions that had operated with relative stability for years. Surveillance operations became more sophisticated, and cross-border cooperation between law enforcement agencies began to expand. These developments created an atmosphere of uncertainty within the trafficking network. Leaders who had once relied on predictable arrangements now faced a landscape that was gradually becoming more unpredictable. Increased enforcement meant that smuggling routes had to be adjusted frequently, and shipments sometimes disappeared under circumstances that were difficult to explain. In this environment, trust became harder to maintain. Traffickers who had once worked together began to view one another with greater suspicion. A missing shipment could raise questions about loyalty, and rumors of cooperation with authorities spread quickly through the network. Even minor misunderstandings carried the potential to damage relationships that had taken years to build. Despite these pressures, the system continued to function. Major trafficking figures still respected many of the boundaries that had defined the earlier structure. Meetings between influential players remained an important tool for managing disputes, and efforts were made to preserve the balance that had allowed the trade to flourish. But the scale of the operations had changed dramatically. The organizations that once operated as regional networks were evolving into complex enterprises with international connections. Their leaders controlled significant financial resources, maintained loyal groups of enforcers, and possessed the logistical expertise needed to move large quantities of drugs across vast distances. For the system that had originally sought to manage the drug trade, this transformation presented a complicated reality. The structure had succeeded in creating order where there had once been disorder. It had centralized power, reduced open conflict, and allowed the trade to expand in a controlled manner. Yet the very success of this strategy had produced organizations whose influence now extended far beyond the limits initially imagined. What had begun as an effort to supervise a fragmented underworld was gradually giving rise to something far larger and more independent. The trafficking families who benefited from the system had grown accustomed to operating with authority and autonomy. As profits continued to rise and international demand showed no signs of slowing, the balance that once held the network together required increasingly careful management. From the outside, the structure still appeared stable. Routes remained active, territories were largely respected, and the trade continued to generate immense wealth. But within the quiet calculations of those who observed the system closely, it was becoming clear that the organizations it had helped create were no longer merely participants in a controlled network. They were evolving into powerful entities capable of shaping the future of the trade on their own terms. By the late 1980s, the fragile balance that had once kept Mexico's drug trade contained within a structured framework was beginning to weaken. For more than a decade, the system had functioned through quiet agreements, carefully defined territories, and an understanding among powerful traffickers that stability protected everyone involved. The arrangement had not eliminated the dangers of the trade, but it had imposed a kind of order on an industry that might otherwise have been consumed by constant conflict. Now, however, the environment surrounding that system was changing. Political currents inside Mexico were shifting in ways that made the older arrangements more difficult to maintain. New leadership within government institutions brought different priorities and new pressures. At the same time, the United States had intensified its focus on drug enforcement, pushing for stronger action against trafficking networks that were supplying a rapidly expanding market across the border. The pressure was not limited to diplomatic requests or public statements. Investigations were becoming more aggressive, surveillance operations more sophisticated, and cooperation between agencies on both sides of the border more frequent. These developments disrupted the quiet predictability that traffickers had once relied upon. Smuggling routes that had operated smoothly for years were suddenly exposed to greater scrutiny. Within the network of traffickers themselves, the mood was also changing. Many of the figures who had originally participated in the carefully managed structure had grown older or lost influence. Some had been arrested, others had stepped away from active operations, and a few had disappeared entirely from the landscape. Their absence left gaps in the hierarchy that had once helped maintain stability. A younger generation of traffickers was rising to fill those spaces. Unlike their predecessors, many of these figures had grown up inside an industry already defined by enormous profits. They had witnessed the transformation of small smuggling ventures into sprawling enterprises that moved vast quantities of drugs across international borders. Their ambitions were shaped by that environment. Where earlier leaders had often prioritized long-term stability, many of the newcomers were more willing to challenge existing arrangements. Territory that had once been respected as belonging to a particular organization began to attract new competitors. Smuggling routes became contested ground rather than established corridors. The quiet discipline that had once governed the trade was gradually giving way to a more aggressive style of competition. For the federal agent who had once helped orchestrate the balance, these developments signaled a loss of control that had once seemed unthinkable. The system he had helped construct relied heavily on relationships, on the ability to influence powerful figures through trust, negotiation, and the shared understanding that cooperation benefited everyone. But as new actors entered the scene, those relationships became harder to maintain. Some of the younger traffickers had little interest in preserving the older order. They saw the existing structure not as a stabilizing force, but as a limitation on their own potential power. The enormous profits available within the global drug market created incentives that were difficult to contain through quiet agreements alone. At the same time, law enforcement operations were beginning to target some of the most prominent figures within the network. High-profile arrests and investigations disrupted the leadership structures that had once coordinated trafficking activity across multiple regions. When a major trafficker was removed from a system, the territory he controlled did not remain empty for long. Rival groups moved quickly to claim the routes and resources that had once belonged to him. This process of fragmentation transformed the landscape of organized crime. What had once been a relatively centralized system began to splinter into competing factions. Smaller organizations emerged, often built around former lieutenants or regional partners who had once operated under a larger network. These new groups were often more localized, more aggressive, and less interested in maintaining the broader balance that had previously governed the trade. As competition intensified, violence began to increase. Conflicts that might once have been resolved through negotiation now escalated into open confrontations. Control of a single smuggling corridor or border crossing could determine the financial future of an entire organization, and the stakes involved made compromise increasingly difficult. Communities that had once experienced the quiet economic influence of trafficking networks now found themselves closer to the violence that accompanied their rivalry. Highways that served as transportation routes for shipments became strategic assets worth defending. Rural regions used for cultivation were suddenly contested spaces where different groups attempted to assert authority. For those observing the transformation from within government institutions, the changes carried a sense of uneasy recognition. The original system had been designed to manage a fragmented underworld by concentrating power into a limited number of organized groups. In its early years, that strategy had succeeded in reducing chaos and allowing authorities to maintain a degree of predictability. But the long-term consequences of that approach were now becoming visible. The traffickers who had been permitted to grow within the system had developed sophisticated organizations with extensive resources. They possessed the logistical expertise, financial networks, and loyal personnel needed to operate independently. When the structure that once guided them weakened, those organizations did not disappear. They simply adapted. Over time, several of these groups evolved into the powerful cartels that would dominate the headlines of the following decades. Their influence extended across entire regions of Mexico, and their operations reached far beyond national borders. What had once been a supervised network had become a complex web of independent organizations competing for control of one of the most lucrative illegal markets in the world. Looking back, investigators and historians would attempt to understand how this transformation had occurred. Many concluded that the early system had played a crucial role in shaping the modern cartel landscape. By organizing the drug trade and allowing